So this video is probably going to be a very serious one in line of my discussion videos and things that have happened in the community as of late that I wanted to take some space to talk about in a serious form. There may be times in this video where I get a little bit emotional given the subject matter in terms of things, but I wanted to let you all know kind of ahead of time what this video would be about. If you're at all sensitive to discussions of sexual harassment, of fan culture that becomes toxic to the point of cyber harassment and things like that, if you're at all sensitive to frank discussions of sexuality and things like that, this may be a video that you may either want to skip through based on the timestamps below or skip entirely for your own mental health. So please, I'll just take care of yourselves accordingly. Hi everyone, my name is Rose, also known as TA Summers. Welcome back to my channel. It's been a little while since I've uploaded a video. I've been working between different videos in tandem with different things, including my Final Fantasy wrap up and like my spoiler review of Final Fantasy, as well as some Final Fantasy books tags and other things. But what I wanted to do, and I don't know if this video is going to go up before those particular videos in terms of things, but in light of some recent discussions within the bookish community, as well as intersections between different fandom communities, I want to take the space to talk about something that has happened recently that's kind of blown up in multiple venues in terms of things. This video is going to talk about the current controversy between Kierra Lewis, Alex and Felicia Wennberg, the Seattle Kraken hockey team, as well as Booktok and the intersection of talking about sports romance specifically. So there's there's a lot of different dialogues that are going on about this right now in terms of things. It has been picked up by multiple outlets: NBC News, Rolling Stone, ESPN, which I expected ESPN probably would pick it up in terms of things, and they had a really good article about it. But it's also been picked up by multiple people in the bookish community in terms of things, especially Booktok. I'm not on Booktok. I did not hear about this through Booktok. I actually heard about it through Twitter, and by extension some of the people that I follow, including Marioness at My Name is Marioness, who covered it brilliantly on her TikTok channel, and also through Jess Owens, who also did a wonderful video kind of wrapping up all of the things that have been going on with respect to this respective controversy. But what I wanted to do in this respective video is kind of give a perspective on it that has an intersection between the professionality of sports, in terms of like my background in exercise and sports science, because as you see in my description, I talk about the fact that I am working on my license for the American College of Sports Medicine as an exercise physiologist. So this is definitely in my wheelhouse. This is what I got my degree in terms of things. And I know a lot about different disciplines within exercise and sports science, including sports psychology, sports marketing, things like that. So there's going to be some discussions of me talking about this as I'm talking about this respective controversy. I'm also passionate about romance. I also love hockey. I am not a Kraken fan, but I am a Carolina Hurricanes fan. So some of that may come up in my later videos in terms of like talking about like, you know, different sports that I love and things like that. But the intersections of everything in terms of where this story has gone, and like in terms of like the intersections of all the things that I'm interested in kind of coming to a head, and it coming to a head in such a really heated conversation led me to say, okay, I need to talk about this in a space where I give my thoughts about it in terms of what my thoughts are about how the fallout happened, what things to be aware of, why it's very specifically, I have no respect whatsoever for the way that Kierra Lewis handled this in terms of things, and I assign a lot of responsibility in her on court in terms of this. So this video is not going to be kind to Kierra Lewis at all. If anything, it's going to be very direct in terms of noting the responsibility and the lack of it that she has in this situation in terms of things specifically. So we'll get into that. But I do want to talk about a little bit about different things before I get into the flux of talking about this fully. So I also want to make it clear that I have several critiques with respect to how the social media team for the Seattle Kraken handled this respective situation as well. There were so many red flags, so many things that were chronically missed in the timeline of when this started up to the point where the fallout happened. And while I feel like there could have been ways to have prevented this in such a way that it did not lead up to the harm that was caused to Alex and Felicia specifically in terms of things. I think that there were also things on the other side of it that, despite the fact that it happened the way that it did, that it could have been better handled in the aftermath as well. But we'll kind of get into that as best as I can talk about it with respect to kind of like my viewpoint of the situation in terms of the timeline, and then kind of looking at specific things that are relevant to both my personal experience as well as professional experience in terms of things. So I do want to stress that this is not an easy conversation or an easy video to be able to film. I know that I'm going to get emotional on certain things on this because I am going to talk about certain personal experiences that kind of have a tangential link to the fallout that I observed with respect to this respective situation. So just be aware, and I'll try to do my best to kind of prepare you like in each section of this where things get a little dicey, so that there's a bit of for you to kind of like know ahead of time whether you need to skip a section or not. So I'll let you know. Without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. Hey all, Editing Rose here. So what I wanted to do is kind of walk through the ESPN article. This was one of many different articles that were published in terms of the Alex Wennberg controversy and the Kraken and Kierra Lewis. You'll see kind of like a rundown of the timeline of events as I read through this article with you and kind of like discuss the timeline a little bit. I had originally done a rundown which didn't have this article at the forefront, but I thought that it was missing certain details, so I decided to re-record it and just read off the article for your reference, just to show you all what actually happened in terms of things, in terms of a good chronicling of what happened. So let's go through this article and kind of talk about it a bit. So the title of the article is Kraken Remove Booktok Content After Alex Wennberg Controversy. And this was written on August 1st, 2023. The Seattle Kraken have removed TikTok videos marketed to the hockey Booktok community after forward Alex Wennberg and his wife Felicia published statements that criticize the objectification of NHL players. Booktok is a commonly used TikTok hashtag by content creators who want to discuss, review, or promote books. A subset of that community focuses on hockey romance novels, with some users fixating on actual NHL players as proxies for fictional characters. One of those players was Wennberg, 28, a 9-year veteran who just completed his second season with the Kraken. His wife, Felicia Wennberg, had joked about that fan fixation in the past. But last week, she published a statement on Instagram that said videos and comments made about her husband had crossed the line of what it means to fancy someone to the point where they sounded predatory and exploiting to her. What doesn't sit with me is when your desires come with sexual harassment and inappropriate comments, and the fact that with the internet we can normalize behavior that would never be okay if we flipped the genders around to a guy doing this to a female athlete. Sure. Oh.
Alex Wennberg published his own statement a few days later, citing that backlash that his wife had received for speaking up about sexual harassment on TikTok in her comments. He noted vile comments on Felicia Wennberg's Instagram, including on photos of their 2-year-old son. The aggressive language about real-life players is too much, he wrote. It has turned into daily and weekly comments on our social media. This is not something we want, support, or want our child to grow up with. All we ask for is a little respect and common sense moving forward. We can all take a joke and funny comments, but when it turns personal and into something bigger that affects our family, we need to tell you that we've had enough. Enough of sexual harassment and harassment of our character and our relationship. Thank you for understanding. When reached by ESPN, the Kraken had no comment on the matter, pointing instead to the statements posted by the Wennberg family. Last winter, the Kraken social media team embraced the hockey Booktok community's interest in their players. The Kraken changed their TikTok bio to mostly Booktok and began publishing videos that targeted that audience. Some featured players like Wennberg and defenseman Vince Dunn walking in slow motion before games while wearing business suits, with captions like, "When you accidentally become a Booktok account, now that's all you can post." But as of Monday, the Kraken had archived any media that referenced Booktok, removing images and videos from all public social media feeds. Links to Wennberg videos on TikTok now result in error messages. The controversy has had a significant impact on the literary corner of hockey fandom. Author Emily Ray's hockey romance books about the fictional Jacksonville Rays have been widely read and discussed on Booktok. She watched her community fracture last weekend when the controversy regarding Wennberg crossed over into wider hockey fandom and media. Booktok is a hashtag that has been used by 1 billion users, she told ESPN. There's been all this rhetoric that Booktok has been sexually harassing Wennberg, and that's not correct. It's not even about hockey romance readers either, because 99% of them are just normal people that found a love for the game and a community. These books have opened the door to hockey. Wraith said that the Wennberg situation is about that 1% that allows the lines between reality and fiction to get blurred. What we're having is this very odd situation where a fandom was created around Alex Wennberg and they took it too far, she said. They weren't treating him like a hockey player or even like a fictional boyfriend. You just saw them sexually fantasizing about him in crass and inappropriate ways in a public forum. Wrath watched this trend unfold on TikTok and then watched the Kraken embrace it. Teams like the Chicago Blackhawks dabbled in Booktok social media outreach too, but not to the level of the Kraken. In May, Seattle invited influencer Kierra Lewis, who has 1.1 million followers on TikTok, to attend a second-round Stanley Cup playoff game against the Dallas Stars. They flew her to Seattle, provided her with tickets, and gifted her a customized Kraken jersey with Booktok on the nameplate. Rath said there was a miscalculation by NHL teams when it came to serving that audience. These NHL teams cannot abstract their players the way that fans do, she said. They're going to treat them like characters in books or treat them as if they're fictional when they're not. But when your company is doing that to you, that's where I draw the line. Rath says she reached out to the Kraken over social media and asked them to stop making content that objectified Wennberg. It was out of concern for Alex. Like, he's a public figure, but at one point, are men in sports allowed to be able to stand up and say, "I do not consent to this objectification"? Men are allowed to set boundaries as well, she said. But it was also out of respect for my readers. They feel so gross. They feel so unwelcome. They feel judged. They could have been about joy and the positive impact of bringing more women into sports. Sexually objectifying your own employees is not the look. That was my take. Rath said that 24 hours after she raised concerns with the Kraken, their social media team posted another Wennberg video that referenced her complaint, publishing it as an act of defiance. But after their playoff run ended, the Kraken began significantly scaling back its Booktok-related content. With the Wennbergs having pushed back so vehemently, the majority of references by Seattle to that community have been scrubbed across the team's social media platforms. Rath applauded the Kraken's decision to remove videos aimed at that segment of the Booktok audience, but she disagreed with the team's decision to not offer a statement about that removal. The Kraken were in the wrong in feeding into it, but they're in the right to stop it, she said. But I think if they're going to expunge the content, they have to make a statement. That looks awful. So this was a very good rundown of all the events that happened in terms of the fallout for Booktok and all the different people who were involved in this. I have so many thoughts. I have so many thoughts to talk about this, and I'll do it in a way that kind of summarizes what major issues were, but I wanted to highlight a few points here in terms of things. It, with respect to the timeline in terms of things, the fact that um, Kierra was invited to the game in light of a lot of the comments that she was making ahead of time did baffle me quite a bit in terms of why that was allowed to stand and encouraged. And I talk a little bit about this later on in the video in terms of things, in terms of how there was a lack of accountability on Kierra's part to own up to her part in that by deflecting to other people who were doing the same thing. But yet, it's with 1.1 million followers in terms of things, you know, there has to be some kind of extent of accountability in terms of the content that she was sharing to her fandom, which eventually made their way over to Felicia's space and harassed her, and then continuously put those sexually explicit comments on her photos, as well as photos of their kid, and where Alex eventually had to step in and say, hey, this isn't right either. So there's a lot of different pieces to this moving puzzle. I wanted to give a general timeline in terms of what happened and how it happened. And this was one of the best articles that kind of gave a rundown of it, like in terms of the professional publication. Though I would also recommend looking at My Name is Marines's TikTok post about this, as well as Jess Owens' video about this as well. They do excellent rundowns while also featuring specifically some of the more explicit content in terms of what Kierra had posted and what caused the consternation and what caused the fallout that led to all of this. So I will see you on the other side.
So I gave you a very brief summary of events that happened with respect to this timeline. Now what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through a lot of the red flags that should have been picked up from point one in this controversy. And I look at this also from the lens of someone who appreciates hockey, who appreciates sport, who appreciates the personhood of players. And I recognize also celebrity culture. I also recognize, like, you know, in terms of fandoms, how fandoms work in different online spaces and things like that. And I also understand it from a perspective in terms of knowing what's, identifying what sexual harassment is and things like that. So we're going to cover a lot of ground in this video in terms of things, and I'm going to try to streamline it as best as I can in a timely manner in terms of things. Let's start with the definition of sexual harassment in terms of things, because Kierra had said that specifically that Felicia had somehow slandered her in terms of saying that she had sexually harassed Alex in her TikToks and things like that, when the reality is that Kierra did sexually harass Alex multiple times. So we're going to get into specifically what the definition of sexual harassment is. So sexual harassment, as defined by Oxford Dictionary, is behavior characterized as the making of unwelcome and inappropriate sexual remarks or physical advances in a workplace or other professional or social situation. And if we're talking about Kierra actually being invited to a Seattle Kraken's game and saying all the stuff that she said about Alex, and essentially saying the things that she said with respect to the players in that game, that was sexual harassment. I don't know how you would argue that wouldn't be sexual harassment in terms of things. And then even then also contextualizing in terms of things, there was never a moment where it felt like Kierra really had like an affection for hockey itself. It just seemed like she had an affection for fan casting this respective player as a person in this book that she picked up, continuously going on about like his looks and body and certain things, like certain practices that are really just standard practice for professional hockey players and athletes, including groin stretches and things like that. There's nothing sexual about those, but yet proceeding to make sexualized comments about things that shouldn't be sexually objectified in terms of things. They're just standard things that athletes do in terms of stretches and things like that. It's just, it's insanely weird, insanely weird. And the fact that this was done even in a series of videos, and the fact that like once you have even one or two videos up on the internet, it's forever. And the fact that there were people who were sending these videos to Felicia and her husband on a daily basis, that's harassment. I'm sorry, but that's exactly what it is. It is harassment. It is harassment of a sexual nature. It is sexual harassment. So I don't know how one would think that that would be a lie or a mischaracterization. It's accurately describing what happened here. So for Kierra to say that Felicia's comments about the situation itself, which included her commentary on the thing, to not be accurate, I don't see how you would not think that Kierra didn't have a responsibility in some of the toxic language that was circulating about Alex, and proceeding to be derogatory in a sexual in these sexualized comments. And one could understand how that could make someone feel uncomfortable in terms of what she was describing in terms of a sexual fantasy. It's one thing, and I'll say this in terms of things like, I think it's perfectly fine to have celebrity crushes, and you know, like crushes of forward-facing people that we may see in terms of things like, you can have those kinds of things where you admire people who whom you see in a performance aspect, whether that be actors, whether that be singers, whether that be athletes in terms of things. You can have those fantasies and those desires in a space where it doesn't have to be toxic. But in this particular case, it became so toxic because it was essentially this fantasy that was being shoved into the space of Alex and Felicia's online thing, to the point where they could not tolerate that. And I would even argue from the point one, when Kierra made that video, it was designed to create an engagement for her respective channel in terms of things. It took no consideration of the personhood of Alex as either a professional hockey player or even as a person, to make the level of comments that she made about him. So I do not know how you would not define this as an example of sexual harassment. And it may have been unintentional for Kierra. That's putting it, I'm being very generous when I say this, because I do think there were certain points of intentionality with this. Maybe not to make Alex uncomfortable, but to drive engagement and sexualize him in a way that removed his personhood. I think that there had to have been some way from point one for like to recognize that Kierra's comments were inappropriate from point one. From a sports marketing perspective, and the thing about it is I kind of see how the timeline of this kind of transpired in terms of where the decision making, why the decisions were made, how they were made. Because if you think about fan engagement in terms of the community, like I've been a part of intersecting spaces in terms of things. I'm a hockey fan, sports romance fan, things like that. I'm not on Booktok, as I mentioned, so that's not my space, but I'm at least familiar with it. I am familiar more with BookTube. And being someone who reads romance, who writes romance, and things like that, like there's all these intersections of fandoms and interests that I know about that kind of come to a head with this respective situation. I see where the Kraken may have thought that, oh, Kierra is a person who is just getting into hockey, really likes this player, really likes this team. Maybe we can have something positive to be able to market through this in terms of things. I really think that if the Seattle Kraken social media team or whoever may have been a part of that decision making in that measure had been properly trained for recognizing sexual harassment and comments and things that could escalate to an abusive nature, I think that this could have been stopped before it even started. So I do think that there is some responsibility with respect to the Seattle Kraken social media team or whomever was a part of the decision making that led to Kierra being invited to the Kraken. Essentially, like making those TikToks of where the lewd comments continued and things like that, and having that content circulate in terms of, I think they had more responsibility than they really admitted to in this, especially with respect to the posting of TikToks that were highlighting Booktok and, like, you know, kind of like doing like a small bit of sexualization with the tailored suits and, like, you know, like talking about these different things in the social media team, which led up to like a lot of these other things like going on in terms of the trajectory of things. I see where like they wanted to try to spin it in a way that was like, because if you think about it in terms of things, I know that there are positive representations that we can have in terms of something being sexy, being cool, being, you know, something to talk about in a positive light. But if we look at where this point started, from point one, Kierra's representation of sexuality and sexualizing this player was not positive from point one. It was not positive. It dehumanized him from point one in terms of things. And it is very clear even from the first TikTok that was made in terms of stuff that things were very explicit and uncomfortable and things like that in terms of her saying that she wanted him to fill all three of her holes. And that even makes me cringe even having to say that in the context of this conversation. That's very explicit sexualization. The buck should have stopped right there and not even continued on from there. Like, that was a red flag situation from point one. If we talk about what sexual harassment can include in terms of things, it's a number of different actions that can range in specificity as well as repeat. It can be repeated. It can be an isolated incident that is very unwelcome and very uncomfortable. It could be like specifically with respect to what Kierra was doing in terms of stuff. It was the equivalent of both catcalling as well as imposing a sexualized fantasy that was attributed to this player that did not take into consideration his personhood whatsoever. And the fact that this has been inescapable in terms of things in a social media space where they have the right to their own respective space, being free of that, should have really put Kierra on notice in terms of the repercussions of the actions and the statements that she was making. But there was a lot of goalpost moving in terms of the way that she kind of removed herself from responsibility in terms of the series of events that happened here, including assigning blame to Felicia, who was simply just kindly telling her to tone it down, and her and others to tone it down. And the reaction of that to double down rather than taking responsibility is one of the things that not only floored me but also infuriated me in terms of things. I'm like, how do you not see the responsibility of what you did and what you said about this guy who you supposedly respect? I don't see how you do. I don't see how Kierra respects this person at all. I don't even think she sees Alex as a human being. Just as she, at one point in the video, she describes Alex looking like a Ken doll. And it almost feels like from the level of the comments that she makes is that there's a level of possessiveness where it's like this is her doll that she's playing with, and subsequently brings in and tosses aside whenever she thinks whenever she thinks she wants to. And that's not the case at all. This is an actual human being that you're talking about, an actual professional person who is playing a game, is at work in a profession that he has been in for quite some time. And you're intruding into that space with things that are not into a space that is not yours to invade, and or to that is not yours to tread upon. It's hard not to get emotional about it, because I'm like, do you not see the harm that you have done? And for the fact that Alex and Felicia both spoke up about it, there was definitely harm done here. There was definitely harm done here. And Kierra refuses to even take an iota of responsibility for it. Especially when, even though she wasn't the only one doing it, and that's one of the excuses that she gives in her TikTok. She's like, I'm not the only person who do it. Yes, you're not the only person who did it, but you're one of the prominent ones who did do it. You're one of the prominent ones voices who did it. You have over 1 million followers. Over 1 million followers who heard you say these things, make these insinuations about Felicia that were very just disrespectful and wrong and toxic, and basically tossing aside Alex's humanity and the whole spectrum of it. So how can you be so quick to say, oh, the Krakens, who I feel do have some responsibility, but they're not the primary ones who perpetuated this. I have criticisms to have of the social media team who aligned with Kierra as she was doing this, but at the same time, when we go back to where this started in terms of things, Kierra played a very heavy responsibility in promoting this toxicity and this language and causing the harm that she did. And so for me, I can't, in good conscience or anything else, remove blame from Kierra for the actions that she took here. And it would be a very different situation if this was a reverse situation where Kierra was, as a Black woman, being subjected to sexualized content that was invading her space multiple times. I almost want to ask, like, in terms of Kierra, do you not realize that if this situation was in reverse and this kind of language is being directed towards you, how would that make you feel? How would that make you feel? Because I know in terms of the perspective that I'm taking from this, having been in a situation where I've had this kind of sexualization done to me as well, that it hurts. It hurts. I don't understand how you would not think it doesn't hurt. Knowing that, like, you know, in terms of being human, being subjected to that kind of language against your will does not make you feel good. In any respect. In any respect whatsoever. I'm going to talk about a very personal story in this segment that I am going to preface with a very heavy trigger warning. And it has some tangentially related measures to this respective situation, even though it is very much on a lesser scale. Is very much like, you know, not in terms of the social media aspect of things. It's basically something that happened to me many years ago, where I was in a space where I thought I was comfortable, and it became a point where it caused harm. So trigger warning for sexual harassment upcoming in this segment of the video. And there may be people who tell me I'm brave for talking about this in terms of things because it's related to exercise and things like that, and being in a public space in terms of where this harassment actually took place. But I don't feel brave saying this in terms of things because, you know, thinking about the fact that someone chose to dehumanize me in this way in a public space in such a forward manner in terms of involving me in something that I had, you know, no part of, didn't even know this person, is part of the point that I want to address in terms of the ways that we as humans can devalue each other, even just doing our own personal things that we love in terms of things, and having that love, having that moment of peace being upended by somebody you don't know, reducing you down to the sum of your parts. So I'm gonna get into this in terms of stuff. This happened many years ago. I was working at, as I mentioned before, like, you know, I have a passion for exercise. I majored in exercise and sports science. Part of my love for that discipline was encouraging other people to exercise and feel good about themselves and things like that. So that's part of the education that I have as the profession that I had was as an American College of Sports Medicine health and fitness specialist, which was later converted to the exercise ACSM exercise physiologist certification, which is one that I'm working towards now. But this did not happen to me in a professional capacity. This was just me going to the gym, my local gym at the time, to work out. And I had been in the middle of kind of like an intense session. I was feeling pretty good about it. I had done a couple of turns on the elliptical and I was feeling great. Like, you know, and I was kind of winding down from my usual routine and doing my cool down stretches. And I remember, you know, like doing some groin stretches in terms of like, you know, as part of that routine, because certain stretches that you do, like in terms of the workouts that you have, are ones that work certain groups of muscles on your body in terms of things. And it can look a little awkward for certain people who are passing by in terms of things, but you keep doing what you do in terms of things because that's part of your routine and it makes you feel good and that kind of thing. This particular workout, I remember being on the mat and I was doing my regular groin stretches, and there were a group of guys that I saw out of the corner of my eye in terms of stuff, and I didn't think anything of it at first in terms of things of firsthand of for it. Like, I was just doing my own thing, and they were just, and I had seen one of them at least point at me, and I'm like, I don't know why they're pointing at me, but I guess they're just looking at me like in terms of doing my workout, so I'm just going to keep doing my own thing. And then I heard one of them. One of them had said this respective line to me, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but it's the scope of what he had said. He had told me, you need to spread your legs a little wider so I can have the chance to dive in. Yeah. Which was a pretty asshole thing to say, if I'm being honest about it. But I remember having to keep my expression very neutral. I did not look at the person in terms of stuff. I actually turned away from him and tried to keep my focus on what I was doing in terms of my stretches, but it gave me pause. And I'm sure that they saw me pause in terms of, like, you know, recognizing exactly what they said. And the other person who was with that guy, with the guy who said it, had said, you know, I don't think she liked that man, and was kind of joking about it in terms of stuff. I was not laughing, though. I kept my expression neutral. I kept my focus, and eventually the group moved away when they knew I wasn't paying them any attention. But when I went to the showers to kind of wind down, I found a stall to kind of like just close myself off. I broke down and cried. I didn't know exactly what I had done to deserve having that said to me, if I'm being honest. It was unwanted. It was this was not a person I knew. This was not a person that I wanted to have any kind of particular fantasy with or anything like that. I had no idea who this person was. And the fact that someone so random could take something that you do on a routine basis, sexualize it, sexualize you in this particular way is not a thing that makes you feel good at all. And I think about that when I think about the situation with respect to Alex, because this is a professional athlete who's just doing his normal stretches, getting into his head into the game, doing his normal routine. And there's this other person who he has never met, saying these kinds of things to him about his routine. And if you have somebody who is doing that kind of thing to you, whether it may be in a casual setting or a professional setting, how does that make you feel? If you are the person who is the target of that, how does that make you feel? And so I cite that experience to try to get people to understand that regardless of who you are, regardless of the level of fame that you have, no one should be subjected to that kind of language. Ever. Ever at all. And I don't understand the complicity of so many people on TikTok, on Booktok. And I'm not ascribing the blame to the whole of TikTok or Booktok. Like, this is not the whole of Booktok. I understand that fully. But to have so many people casually brush off these kinds of comments being directed towards a human being that was unwanted, that he has actually spoken up about and said, hey, you guys need to cool it. His wife has spoken out about it. You guys need to cool it. That should have been the point where it stopped. That should have been the point where it stopped. It should have never even began, but that should have been the point where it stopped. And I am still, even remembering my experience, and that is not even the only experience that I've had that was dehumanizing and humiliating in terms of commentary and actions that were hurled towards me in terms of spaces of where I was supposed to feel safe. So, you know, I can empathize with the the level of frustration and horror in terms of the level of the derogatory language being aimed and that not feeling good in terms of Alex and his wife trying to say, hey, this isn't okay. And you would think that with the person who is supposed to be like, you know, like supposedly part of a joke, if it's not funny to them anymore, then why are you still laughing about it? Why are you still continuing to do the things that you're doing, that you're saying? Why does it not simply stop there? Why does it not stop? Those are the kinds of questions that I ask in terms of Kierra, in terms of being able to assume responsibility for the things that she said when it clearly caused harm. And to talk about my respective experience, I never saw the guys again. I had kind of avoided the gym for about a couple of weeks after that particular incident happened, but when I went back, they weren't there anymore. But it's something that in spaces where you are allowed to have your own sense of expression, why is it that certain people can't be allowed to be able to interact in a way that feels safe and comfortable and not be subjected to that kind of language towards them? I know that we have spaces of fandom. I know that we have spaces where, you know, healthy expressions of sexuality as well as expression of that attraction are valued. But if it's done so at the expense of one's well-being and personhood, then that is a problem. And I think that is a problem that is worth hearing and understanding and respecting. There seems to be this level of disconnect when it comes to public-facing individuals, celebrities, things like that, where there are people who are part of fandoms who don't realize that these comments and these things are occurring in public spaces where they think they can't be seen, but they are actually very visible in terms of things. And one of the things that you are taught in some of these public-facing positions, including athletes, is that you are taught to not react to that, or to be able to keep inside your headspace because you are in a public-facing position and people can scrutinize your reactions to things. And that's one of the reasons why you see, like, in terms of things like what Alex had said in his Instagram, where like, you know, you're taught not to react to things, but and speak up about things. And he also talks about Felicia being the one to speak up because, you know, like, she's braver and she can have the space to be able to talk about it and the knowledge to talk about it. But there's a sense of, like, fans of particular celebrities or well-known figures and things like that to not think of the people whom they see as desirable or the objects of their affections or what have you as human beings capable of having the right to having personhood in terms of things. And that just because you have a certain sentiment towards that person doesn't mean that you own their reactions or can project your fantasies onto them in terms of things, because that kind of thing does not feel good, especially like even if you're like thinking of people interacting in just a regular space. If you try to project a certain fantasy, like that kind of fantasy unwillingly towards another person who's like, what do I have to do with that? I have nothing to do with that. You know, you don't have ownership of a person just because you like them. You don't have ownership of a person's personal space, personhood. That's kind of the crux of what consent is. Consent entails being able to say no or imply on things that imply that you're not comfortable with things. And even if there's a point where you can't explicitly give consent, there has to be lines drawn in terms of boundaries, personal boundaries that have to be respected between people, regardless of your status. And I think there are so many people who seem to forget that, even in the collective notations of celebrity culture in terms of stan culture, that don't recognize those boundaries. And even the term stan, as we know it in collective culture, that was not a positive term in terms of when it was created. The term stan comes from Eminem's song Stan, in which it depicts a man who essentially is a super fan of Eminem and does these horrible things to his girlfriend, you know, in the name of this particular fan, like in terms of being a fan of Eminem, and essentially telling in this respective story like the things that he does that are hurtful and harmful. And then by the time that like get towards the end of the song Stan, where Eminem's character is writing back to the person who did this, Stan, girlfriend's dead. They're dead. So, you know, there has to be a point where we look at interactions. If we are to cultivate spaces online where all of us can feel safe and comfortable, we have to recognize those boundary lines. And we have to be able to be cognizant of and respectful of when a boundary is drawn. That boundary has to be respected, regardless of the person in terms of, you know, their perceived level of untouchability. Because the thing about it is, it's like you're not, like, regardless of, like, you know, like where you are in terms of, you know, status or stature, there are lines that you can draw, like in terms of boundaries, so that everyone can feel safe in this public space or in their public spaces. And the level of harassment that Kierra and her followers directed towards Alex and Felicia seems to cover up for the fact that instead of taking responsibility for saying some of these horrible things and unwanted things, they move the goalpost towards really assigning blame to other people other than themselves. And that does nothing to really help the situation in terms of things. While, yes, I can say that the social media team for the Krakens handled that terribly, it still doesn't remove the original fact that these these debasing comments in terms of sexual harassment that were hurled at them, at Alex and Felicia, still happened. So, and trying to redirect that dialogue into rumors, as well as other things that are not factually accurate, in an attempt to deflect the hypersexualization and the uncomfortable and the unwanted commentary that was directed toward Alex. That, you know, there has to be a reckoning in terms of being able to take responsibility for actions and things that were said that were harmful. And I don't think there's any kind of responsibility taken on Kierra's part to be able to do that. And whether that comes, I don't know. I really don't know. I hope that it does. I hope that Kierra takes the opportunity to say, I'm sorry. It doesn't seem like that she will, given the statement that was given on TikTok in terms of where she attacks Felicia and kind of like shifts the blame a bit. I don't think that apology will ever come. And that's unfortunate because she did cause harm. Even if other people were doing it, I don't buy the other people who are doing it as an excuse to certain things, because just because one person does something wrong, it doesn't give you license to do the same wrong thing. If you see someone doing something wrong, if you see someone participating in something that makes someone else feel uncomfortable, you don't just complicitly let it go. Because if it was somebody that you knew or somebody that you cared about, then you would you intervene? That's the question. I don't think Kierra, like from what Kierra has done here, you know, it doesn't say anything good about her actions or her culpability or her ability to react to things in terms of stepping in when someone does something harmful, especially if she's the person who's perpetuating the harm. Yeah, it's hard to speak about, really, and I think that there's a lot to be reckoned with in terms of the issues following this fallout, with respect to social media culture, with respect to respecting boundaries, with respect to the expression of infatuation, or the expression of being able to talk about, fanning some, like being a fan of someone, or having a famous crush or things like that in a way that's healthy for everybody, and not just doing things to sensationalize or gain clout, or even to the point where like this loud and brass and this shocking sense of dehumanization, which generates views at the expense of a person's personhood. You know, there has to be a conversation there to be able to stop that kind of thing from happening. And it's not so much that this is in terms of whether it's hockey fandom, whether it's sports fandom, whether it's celebrity fandom, whether it's romance fandom. Like, this is not a new phenomenon. This has happened in multiple different fan spaces. And there's a larger conversation to be had about how we, talk about, real people in the perspective of fan spaces without crossing the line of being dehumanizing towards other people, because everything seems to be online, and because social media is such a large presence and stuff like that, you can't exactly say that nobody sees that kind of thing when it happens in a situation like this, because it's absolutely seen, it's absolutely heard, and it absolutely was addressed by the people who were are targets of this situation. And until we have a reckoning of responsibility and people, you can't, and people recognizing other people's personhood, regardless, to not make these kinds of actually dehumanizing comments, it's going to keep happening. And that's the unfortunate thing about this, that, you know, there are going to be people who think that this kind of behavior is okay and continue to do it, and then continue to do it not just even to famous people, but they can do it to anybody that they want to. And that's not okay. And because, and it really even shouldn't even be, like, it should be obvious, but so many people seem to miss the point. Like, I mentioned in one of my Twitter threads about seeing the video of the viral, I think it happened at Disney World with one of the character actors with Gaston, where there was a female fan who groped his chest, and he basically directed her to leave. And the woman thought he was joking at first, and he said, no, you need to leave, which was absolutely the right thing to do. It stunned me, and I had said this in my Twitter thread, like, you know, that there were so many people defending the woman who did it, because that was an invasion of his personal space. And I do know that he had said that it wasn't so much the fact that he felt uncomfortable, but the fact that he was in a professional space with children and multiple audiences, and he didn't want to promote that behavior, which, you know, good on him. But, you know, even if this were happening in, let's say, like an adult space, or a space where a person was not asked in terms, or didn't consent to that, it wouldn't be okay for someone to just go up and do that to another person, regardless, because you don't have ownership of another person's body. You don't have ownership of another person's being. And you can't touch them whenever you want to. You have to ask for permission. You have to ask for consent. So my hope is that this incident makes people more aware of how important it is to respect boundaries and respect consent of people, and know that consent can be revoked at any time when it gets to the point where it's hurtful and harmful. And to also recognize, even from point one, where something is harmful, and say, hey, are you thinking about, you know, how this affects the person that you're directing this commentary toward? Because I think that should be the forefront of a person, like, even if you have, like, you know, desires for a celebrity person or something like that. Like so many of us do have fan crushes and stuff like that, but, you know, is there no pause for the level of commentary that you may direct towards someone who's actually a real human being, to remove their personhood like that in terms of things? Are you thinking about how that is done, and that you're not saying something that removes that personhood from them? Because people are objects. They aren't inhuman. They're not toys. They're not dolls. They're not things to do with that you have ownership of. And being able to recognize the personhood of every person you're coming across, regardless of status or identity or things like that, is important. So I say that in terms of trying to shed a light in terms of how to interact. There have to be respectable limits in terms of how we engage, in terms of how we treat each other in social media, as well as what we use in terms of how we address each other online and in person, and respecting each other's personhood. So I know I'm going to probably edit a lot of this in terms of how long-winded I am in repeating certain points, but I'm trying to sort out my thoughts in terms of how to best address this. in this video. To kind of start winding this conversation down a little bit in terms of things, first, to directly tie it into my background in terms of things, there are a lot of aspects of this conversation that have to do with different disciplines I studied under exercise and sports science in terms of things, including if you think about the aspect of sports psychology, which goes into like either thinking about athletic participation in terms of motivation, in terms of things that can cause a player anxiety and things like that. It's obviously, this particular situation is a very stress-inducing situation to be in terms of things, regardless of how you think about it in terms of things, because you're thinking about the different dimensions of how this affects the player in terms of being able to get into his headspace when he is going into the game and trying to play. And having, people who are in the space that he's normally, working within, like screaming and yelling these different, comments in terms of things that can affect his performance and affect, being able to have the headspace to be in the game. Now, in terms of working with athletes, in terms of the profession, in terms of things, we've been taught to say that there are ways that you can best protect yourself in terms of getting into your headspace and getting into the game and like being on. But that teaching, that level of protection only goes so far if we can't cultivate a space where everybody can feel safe. And trying to remove remove the responsibility of in terms of how you act during games or how you treat different players and things like that as being a fan, as a fan and placing it on the player's responsibility solely doesn't do any good. Because the thing about it is you can only provide so much protection from that kind of context. That has an effect. The other piece of it is looking at the sports marketing perspective, which I talked about a little bit in my earlier sections. And as a social media team, you have a duty to be able to protect, the players on your team, the different staff members and things like that, the people who make up the social circles and the professional circles of these athletes and things like that in terms of things. And you want to cultivate a culture that's more positive and that's going to give you engagement, that's going to have safe interactions for everybody. But when you have this group of people who are creating a space where it makes the player or other people feel uncomfortable and unsafe, then you have to take a step back and be able to evaluate, okay, is this going to be a situation where this can cause harm and affect the team or a specific player or anybody that's in this respective circle? You have to ask yourself questions. Is this the best engagement? Do the whole strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis, which I feel like, that could have been handled better in terms of looking at whether engaging with Kierra in the way that they did was the best option to do. And I know that this is probably going to have an effect in terms of who they recruit, in terms of engagement, in terms of fan engagement and things like that. I think there is a healthy way to be able to do it and still promote a positive effect. But the signs were there, the red flags were there in terms of things that were not okay, that could easily escalate into something that's bad. And of course, once they recognized that it was bad, they course corrected. But in the term of doing that course correction, they didn't take responsibility for the part that they played in that harm. So I think there's definitely much learning to do in terms of being able to take accountability, being able to assess how can we prevent this from happening again or happening to another player, or essentially having another media row where it feels like people are being singled out on things. And this is not me saying that Kierra was singled out specifically. She was not, in the perspective in terms of Felicia being able to talk about the general perspective of a commentary that was sexualizing her husband and sexually harassing her husband. Kierra was just one of many different players, but the fact that Kierra does not accept responsibility for her part in that is an issue in and of itself. And the fact that there are her followers who are basically trying to support her in some odd fashion in terms of things and not recognizing the harm that they did is troublesome, to say the least. So there are a lot of different moving pieces to this issue, and I don't think that this is the last conversation that we're going to have on this issue, because it happens in so many other different fandom spaces that at some point it's going to happen again, and it's going to cause harm to yet another person. And until we reckon with, you know, being able to recognize the boundaries that need to be placed and treated with the decency, dignity, and respect that holds, it's going to keep happening again. So I want to wrap this up and say that there's a lot to this, and I hope the best for Alex and Felicia in the aftermath of all of this. I hope that Kierra can actually come to some sort of terms in terms of the responsibility she played in this. It's doubtful. I don't have a lot of confidence in that in terms of things based on the reactions that she's already had for this and the kind of support that she's had, like with no one to really call her in and say. And even with the issues with the call-in in terms of things, the fact that Kierra was basically demanding a call-in in a specific way from Felicia missed the point of her responsibility for her actions and her words. So, and as many people have already said before, that I want to reiterate, if you're making a comment in a public space that causes harm, you do not have the right to demand a call in a specific way. If you caused harm, you know, in terms of things, you don't have the right to demand that kind of thing. Because if you did so in a public space, people are going to say in a public space, hey, you said this very harmful thing. And that's something that you have to reckon with and not use as a deflection for the harm that you caused. And I say that in terms of, like, you know, seeing some of the toxic behavior that I've seen with respect to this. It's a hard conversation to have, and there are a lot of different things that we could talk about in terms of the ethics of it, with respect to sports, with respect to fandom, with respect to a lot of things. And I'm happy to have those kinds of conversations, even in a deeper capacity than I was able to do in this video. But I hope that this particular incident provides an examination of how things can be done better and how we can treat each other better. So I'm going to leave the conversation there. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell to be informed of when I post new videos. Thank you again for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next video.